In this video, we're going to talk about the 2015 film, Spectre. And warning, spoiler alert. In 2012, the world saw the release of the amazing Skyfall, which blew away audiences and critics and delighted even the most cynical of die-hard 007 fans. With the 1-2 punch of Casino Royale and Skyfall creating two of the greatest James Bond movies, it looked like Daniel Craig was quickly becoming one of the greatest James Bonds of all time, quickly beating out Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and even Pierce Brosnan to challenge even the great one, Sean Connery. And let's face it, in 2012, Skyfall was considered a masterpiece. And what made Skyfall a masterpiece was that it set up a future of the James Bond franchise to have unlimited possibilities, even suggesting that Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, and Skyfall were a prequel trilogy that could lead into the other movies that we've already seen, like the 007 adventures of Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and the Pierce Brosnan 007s. That idea was incredible. Plus, I felt that one more really great Daniel Craig film could help him go down in history as arguably the best James Bond. Then, to my delight and surprise, Sam Mendes, who had just directed Skyfall, actually agreed to return and direct the next movie. So wow! It would be the first time since John Glenn that a director would return to direct consecutive movies. And we remember John Glenn, the quintessential 80s Bond director who directed For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill, and for many in Generation X, he's the reason why we love James Bond. And then we got Christoph Waltz, the amazing Christoph Waltz, who had played the Nazi Jew hunter Colonel Hans Landa in Inglourious Bastards, whom along with Heath Ledger's Joker was the character that Raul Silva was based on. So we were basically going to get another Skyfall. That was so awesome. How could it miss? Well, I remember I saw Spectre on opening night in November of 2015. No, not opening night. I actually had to see it during the Thursday preview because I couldn't even wait for opening night. And it was in a packed theater and everyone was hyped up since Skyfall. And I think the entire theater had high expectations. And little did we know that we were about to be very disappointed. And it is kind of sad about Spectre being so disappointing because it's a beautifully filmed movie. And there are some really cool individual scenes. The opening pre-credit action sequence in Mexico was one continuous tracking shot, just like Sam Mendes would later do in 1917. We got a heart-pounding helicopter action sequence that was done practically with a real helicopter. We got a new Aston Martin DB10 with all sorts of cool 007 gadgets. We got Monica Bellucci as the first Bond girl. And then we got Dave Bautista as the villain's henchman. We got a really cool car chase through the streets of Rome, actually done for real, not CGI. And then we finally got to meet Blofeld at a giant Italian castle in Rome called the Palazzo Cardenza, and his introduction was actually very creepy. And then we got the return and final death of Mr. White, and then we got an exciting action sequence in the Austrian mountains, and an exciting fight scene between Bond and Mr. Hinx on board a train. And then we got to the hidden Spectre base in the desert, and we met Ernst Stavro Blofeld face to face. And the movie slowly began to unravel. First, Blofeld was not very threatening. He was kind of goofy, and when he yells, cuckoo, cuckoo, he looked like an idiot.
So thank you, cuckoo.
And I get it, cuckoos are birds that replace a biological child and trick the parents into raising it, and Blofeld sees Bond as a cuckoo, right? But it's a fairly unimpressive simile, and surely doesn't rise to be the motif of this entire movie, and it certainly doesn't excuse Blofeld for acting like an idiot. And then we're supposed to believe that the entire motivation for Blofeld spending all of Spectre's resources to torture James Bond is because he grew up with James Bond and was jealous that Bond got more attention? What? And that's it. The problem with this movie is Blofeld. But he's pretty much the point of the entire film. Blofeld is Bond's surrogate brother, and he's messing with James Bond because he's jealous that his father gave James Bond more attention? Think about that. I'm supposed to believe this guy, this petty brat, is the mastermind behind the world's most powerful criminal organization? This guy? And all the events of the last three movies, including Raul Silva, was all engineered by Blofeld? What made Skyfall so great was that it was completely a separate adventure, unrelated to the previous two movies. It modged the pattern set by Goldfinger, which was independent from Dr. No and From Russia with Love, and then after this independent adventure, they went back to Spectre in Thunderball. And now we're supposed to believe that Silva was a pawn to Blofeld? Like this guy? It was all so bad. It's so laughably bad. So bad it completely ruined this movie and kind of ruined the previous movies. Watching Spectre, it's like going to a nice restaurant, for a steak. And everything about the place, the decor, the waitstaff, the china plates, the silverware, it's all nice. Right? The appetizer's good, the wine's good. Everything's good, but when the steak comes out, it's spoiled meat with maggots crawling all over it. I don't care how good everything else was, it's gonna ruin your evening. And yes, Blofeld in this movie is equivalent to a rotten steak with maggots in it. Like, I stand by that analogy. And when you have a James Bond movie where the main villain, Blofeld, turns out to be James Bond's goofy, jealous, petty brother, who was supposedly the mastermind behind Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, and Skyfall, because he was jealous that his father gave him more attention, yeah, it ruined the movie. And all I kept thinking was that Austin Powers, a ludicrous parody of James Bond, actually did the exact same thing 2 decades earlier, and they did it better. You can't make this up.
What are you going to do now, Austin?
Dad? What are you doing here?
I have to protect my son.
Dad, I'm fine.
I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about him.
What? Dr. Evil's not your son. I am.
You both are.
Did Sam Mendes realize there was an Austin Powers movie that did this? Well, you can't come back from that. I remember I was so shocked at how bad this movie was that I had to go see it again. Like, my wife already knew. Like, she hated it. So I had to go alone on Saturday morning, literally 2 days later, and that's when I realized how much this movie sucked. This is a complete stain on Daniel Craig's legacy as James Bond, and let's face it, No Time to Die didn't exactly help Daniel Craig's legacy. Daniel Craig went from potentially being the best 007 after Skyfall to now being potentially one of the worst. Like, what a fall from grace. And it was a complete stain on Sam Mendes as the director. Although thankfully he will be able to salvage his directing career in 2019 with the brilliant film 1917. Well, let's talk about this film and how it got made, and maybe illuminate how you completely go from Skyfall to Spectre. Now, of course, Daniel Craig would return for this film, but contrary to popular belief, he did not have a 4-film contract. After the success of Casino Royale, Daniel Craig had a loose 4-film agreement between Eon Productions, MGM, and himself, and that's why he was able to negotiate so much money. So how much did Daniel Craig make for Spectre? Well, Daniel Craig received $24 million for starring in this, and another $6 million for endorsements, which he would make from product placement, plus a total percentage cut of the profits, which earned him another $9 million. So it is rumored that he made $39 million for being in Spectre, making him the highest paid James Bond actor ever. So initially, after the mega success of Skyfall, everyone wanted Sam Mendes to return to direct Bond 24, but in March of 2013, Sam Mendes actually went on record to say that he would not be directing the next James Bond movie, but then teased that he might consider returning if the right script came along. So since Sam Mendes was not going to direct this movie, there were rumors that they'd approach Christopher Nolan, and that would have been incredible. Because I'm telling you, one day I hope to see a Christopher Nolan directed James Bond film. Other directors that were considered were Ang Lee, Shane Black of Iron Man 3 fame, Tom Hooper, who directed The King's Speech and Les Miserables, and David Yates, who directed the last 4 Harry Potter films, and Danny Boyle, who directed Slumdog Millionaire, 28 Days Later, and 127 Hours, as well as Trainspotting. Incidentally, Danny Boyle would be hired for No Time to Die before he would leave the project, leaving it to Cary Fukunaga. Well, a few months later, Sam Mendes said that he did find the right script, found it appealing, and officially announced that he would return to direct. But Sam Mendes had a vision to do something very different for his second 007 film. He wanted to make 2 films that stood as 2 very different and distinct films. Dennis Gassinger, who was a production designer on the last film, returned as production designer. But for cinematographer, Sam Mendes did not hire Roger Deakins, who had dazzled everyone with his cinematography on Skyfall. And the reason was because on Spectre, he and Sam Mendes had very different visions for the film. Roger Deakins mainly worked in the digital film medium and always shoots his movies entirely with a digital ARRI Alexa camera. His approach to filmmaking is to create a visually stunning, warm, and highly stylized modern film. Think of that fight scene in Skyfall with the giant neon jellyfish in the background, right? That's classic Roger Deakins. On the other hand, Sam Mendes wanted to do something special for this movie. He wanted to film it entirely in 35mm film, not digital. And the reason was he wanted to create a nostalgic look that reminded fans of an old James Bond movie from the days of old Hollywood. Like think of Dr. No and From Russia with Love. The two decided not to work together on Bond 24, but fear not, cinema fans, Roger Deakins and Sam Mendes would work together again on the 2019 film 1917, which will earn Roger Deakins an Academy Award for cinematography, and they'll work together on the 2022 film Empire of Light. And right now, the two are working together on a 4-part Beatles biopic. For Bond 24, Sam Mendes hired Hoyt van Hoytema, who took over duties as cinematographer. And this at the time was seen as an excellent choice. Hoyt van Hoytema is known for his collaborations with Christopher Nolan and was the cinematographer on The Fighter, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Her, and Nolan's 2014 film Interstellar. I mean, he's arguably one of the only people that could match Roger Deakins and possibly even exceed him. Now, after Spectre, Hoyt van Hoytema would go on to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Cinematography for the 2017 film Dunkirk, and in 2023, he'd win an Academy Award for Best Cinematography for Oppenheimer. And Sam Mendes and Hoyt van Hoytema really wanted to do something artistic and experimental with this movie. They wanted to make an old-school Hollywood film, not only harkening back to the days of the original James Bond films, like Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger, but even go back further to movies like old John Ford westerns, with the wide epic shots, as well as Alfred Hitchcock films like North by Northwest. Remember, Alfred Hitchcock films inspired the early Bond movies, especially From Russia with Love. Hoyt van Hoytema used deep shadows, soft highlights, and strong contrasts. The sets would be ornate. It would have luxurious ballrooms and foggy city streets, where wide-shot introductions to settings look like artistic painting. Notice that? When we're introduced to a new setting, it looks like a gorgeous oil painting. And all the stars would have glamorous costumes inspired by old Hollywood. In fact, Monica Bellucci's outfits were directly inspired by Sophia Loren, and Léa Seydoux' dresses were directly inspired by Grace Kelly. So now you see what Sam Mendes and Hoyt van Hoytema were trying to go for. Think of this plan when you think of the funeral of Marco Sciarra, or the Palazzo Cardenza, or the car chase through the empty streets of Rome. They were channeling old Hollywood. And another thing Sam Mendes and Hoyt van Hoytema did was to have every scene linger much longer than usual. Because in modern movies, you get a lot of fast cuts. Like a scene will jump from one scene to another, desperately trying to prevent the audience from getting bored. That's the kind of filmmaking we're used to. But if you watch an old movie, the camera lingers, right? The scene lingers. And you might even see a character walk a long way through a hallway or a ballroom. And that's what they did here. You see Bond walk through a courtyard. You see characters have a quiet moment alone. You see Bond and Madeline wait for a bus. That's what old Hollywood movies did, and that's what they did here. And had the main course of this movie been more than a rotten steak with maggots in it, maybe the old Hollywood thing might have worked, right? Who knows? The script itself was written by James Bond franchise regulars Neal Purvis and Robert Wade, who had written every James Bond movie since The World Is Not Enough. And after they finished their first draft, Eon Productions hired Jez Butterworth, a playwright who had just written the Tom Cruise sci-fi movie The Edge of Tomorrow. They brought him in to help rewrite the script. And Jez Butterworth would go on to write the brilliant Ford vs. Ferrari and the less brilliant Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But as this movie was in pre-production, on November 2013, something incredible happened. Eon Productions got the rights to Spectre. So this was the first time since Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, 42 years ago, that they would be allowed to have Spectre appear in any of the 007 films. prior to them obtaining Spectre, the filmmakers had created Quantum, which was basically a huge Spectre-like organization that had a completely different name, but was, for all practical purposes, wink wink, Spectre. So how come Eon Films did not have the rights to Spectre after 1971, and how did they get it back? This is a whole epic story, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. So before Ian Fleming met producers Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, he met with another movie producer named Kevin McClory in 1958. And the two worked on a screenplay called Longitude 78 West with screenwriter Jack Whittingham, where they created the organization of Spectre and its leader, Blofeld. Then Ian Fleming lost faith in Kevin McClory when Kevin McClory's movie, The Boy in the Bridge, was released and it was a critical and box office bomb. So Ian Fleming dumped Kevin McClory and then published his next book, Thunderball, which featured Spectre and Blofeld as the main antagonists. And in 1961, Kevin McClory sued and claimed that Thunderball was too similar to the screenplay, Longitude 78 West. And in court, Kevin McClory was winning when Ian Fleming had a heart attack. And in November 1963, the court case continued, but due to poor health, Ian Fleming settled out of court. And Ian Fleming got the rights to the novel Thunderball, but had to have the novel, say, based on a screen treatment by Kevin McClory, Jack Whittingham, and the author, while Kevin McClory gained the film rights to the story and the characters. Then, 9 months later, Ian Fleming had another heart attack on 12th August 1964 and died at the age of 56. So after the success of Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman's third 007 movie, Goldfinger, the two decided to make Thunderball with Kevin McClory, paid him a whole bunch of money, and got the rights to use Spectre and Blofeld for 10 years. So Eon Productions got to use Spectre and Blofeld for the next 10 years in You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Diamonds Are Forever, but afterwards, the 10 years had expired, and Eon Productions could no longer use Spectre nor Blofeld in any of their movies. That right belonged back to Kevin McClory. And that's why in 1983, Kevin McClory was able to team up with Jack Schwartzman and make a competing James Bond movie when it made Never Say Never Again. Now, if you want a much more detailed version of the story, check out my video on Thunderball or Never Say Never Again, and I'll leave a link in the description below. Well, in 2006, Kevin McClory passed away at the age of 82, and 7 years after his death, the McClory estate settled with Danjak, the company now owned by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, and MGM, and they were able to acquire the rights to Spectre and all associated characters, including Blofeld. Now, to this day, no one knows how much Danjak paid the McClory family to acquire the rights, but everyone assumes it must have been a lot of money. Now, when this film started pre-production, Eon originally wanted Gary Oldman for the role of Blofeld. However, Oldman could not commit to the brutal 6-month shooting, and he declined. Contrary to rumors, Kevin Spacey was never considered for Blofeld. Another actor, Chiwetel Ejiofor, was considered for the role, and I think that could have been interesting. However, Ejiofor was then cast as C, Max Denby, but then lost the role to Andrew Scott, who is best known for playing Moriarty on Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman's BBC series, Sherlock. Christopher Waltz was hired as Ernst Stavro Blofeld, and at the time I was very excited for his casting because I was a huge fan of Waltz. He genuinely terrified me in Inglourious Basterds, and I really liked him in Django Unchained. In fact, I'm still a Christopher Waltz fan. Christopher Waltz was born on October 4th, 1956 in Vienna, Austria, and was raised in a theatrical family. His parents were set and costume designers, so Waltz trained at the Max Reinhardt Seminar and later moved to New York, and he rose to international fame through his work with director Quentin Tarantino, winning multiple awards for his role as the menacing Colonel Hans Landa in Inglourious Basterds, and then the charismatic bounty hunter Dr. King Schultz in Django Unchained. And the filmmakers wanted the fact that Christopher Waltz's Blofeld to be a surprise. So when Waltz was first announced, the studio kept his role secret, officially calling him Franz Oberhauser, the son of Bond's childhood mentor. And this was a deliberate misdirection to hide the fact that he was Blofeld, kind of like what they did with Benedict Cumberbatch not being Khan in Star Trek Into Darkness, because, that worked out so well. Waltz himself initially downplayed the idea he was playing Blofeld, insisting in interviews that his character was not Blofeld, though audiences suspected otherwise. His casting was not only a nod to his proven talent, but also an effort to reimagine Blofeld for the Daniel Craig era, giving the character a personal connection to Bond. And that connection is his jealous, petty foster brother. Ugh. For the henchman, Mr. Hinx, they cast Dave Bautista. And they wanted to go back to the invincible, strong henchman of the old Bond films, most notably portrayed by Oddjob in Goldfinger and Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, but also characters like Kriegler in For Your Eyes Only and Gobinda in Octopussy. Dave Bautista was a huge James Bond fan, and several years before being cast in this movie, he had publicly spoke about how much he loved the 007 movies. Dave Bautista was born David Michael Bautista Jr., born on January 18, 1969 in Washington, D.C., and rose to fame in the WWE in the early 2000s, where his imposing physique, charismatic presence, and signature moves like the Batista Bomb helped him become the World Heavyweight Champion and WWE Champion. Then after leaving wrestling, Bautista made a successful transition into acting, where he shocked audiences by stealing the movie as Drax the Destroyer in Guardians of the Galaxy, but then showing a surprisingly soft side in Blade Runner 2049. His role here was part of his eventually successful transition into acting, next leading to prominent roles in Dune, Army of the Dead, Glass Onion and Knives Out Mystery, as well as him being excellent in the movie Knock at the Cabin. Monica Bellucci was hired for the role of the first Bond girl, the widow of the Spectre assassin Bond kills at the beginning of the movie. And Monica Bellucci is probably best known for her portrayal of Persephone in the movie Matrix Reloaded, and more recently for her role as Beetlejuice's wife in the 2024 film Beetlejuice. And she was gorgeous in that movie, a role she played at the age of 60. Now, nearly 20 years earlier, Monica Bellucci had auditioned for the role of Paris Carver in Tomorrow Never Dies, and Pierce Brosnan lobbied very hard for her to be in it, but producers decided to go in a very different direction and hired Terry Hatcher. Now, I was really excited to see Monica Bellucci in this movie, and I actually thought she was going to be the main Bond girl, so I ended up being a little disappointed that she's only in this movie for about 3 minutes. But again, it was still cool to see her, and at the age of 51, she still looked great. Although I thought she even looked better at 60 years old in Beetlejuice. And she will go down in history as the oldest Bond girl ever. And for the first time in franchise history, the Bond girl is a decade older than the actor playing James Bond. Monica Anna Maria Bellucci was born on September 30th, 1964 in Umbria, Italy, and began her career modeling for major brands such as Dolce & Gabbana and Dior before transitioning into acting in the early 1990s. And Bellucci has appeared in films across Italy, France, and Hollywood, delivering memorable performances such as in the Matrix sequels and playing Mary Magdalene in The Passion of the Christ. As for the main Bond girl, the filmmakers wanted a very different kind of Bond woman, someone who was intelligent, independent, and not a stereotypical femme fatale or damsel in distress. And so director Sam Mendes and producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were looking for a character who could challenge James Bond emotionally and intellectually, as well as be a true equal rather than a fleeting romantic interest, and they found French actress Léa Seydoux. Léa Seydoux was born on July 1st, 1985 in Paris, France, and she was raised in a prominent family with deep ties to the French cinema industry. Her grandfather chairs the iconic French film company Pathé, and another relative chairs Gaumont. She initially trained in music and later acting, and overcame childhood shyness. She first gained wide notice with the 2008 film The Beautiful Person and the 2010 film Dear Prudence, but achieved international breakout success with Blue is the Warmest Color, for which she won major acclaim, leading her to be cast in this movie. So let's talk about this movie. So it starts out with the traditional gun barrel sequence. And this is huge, right? This is the first time ever in the entire Daniel Craig 007 series that we have ever started a movie with a gun barrel sequence. And it's been 13 years since we've seen the sequence at the beginning of a Bond movie. So it's awesome. And I remember it giving me chills in the theater. And then the screen goes dark and we get text. The dead are alive. What? Okay. That was weird. But it's going to be okay, right? This movie's going to be great. I know it's going to be great. So we're in Mexico City and it's the Day of the Dead celebration. And the movie starts with a huge skeleton head. pan to a man dressed in a white suit and a skull mask, but this is not Bond, but this is the man Bond is pursuing, a Spectre agent named Marco Sciarra. And close behind is Bond in a black suit and a black top hat and skull mask, and he looks like Baron Samedi from Live and Let Die. And apparently Sam Mendes' favorite James Bond movie is Live and Let Die, and Live and Let Die was Daniel Craig's first James Bond movie that he saw, so this introduction is an homage to that film. We track Bond and his female companion through the streets of Mexico City and into a hotel, up the elevator, and into their hotel room, and this is all one continuous tracking shot. And it's a really cool effect, and Sam Mendes will go on to make an entire movie using this technique in the brilliant 2019 World War I film, 1917. And it makes you wonder if using it here is what inspired him to make that movie. Now, one complaint that I've had is the color grading of this entire sequence. And I have to agree. Sam Mendes and cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema chose the drab sepia tone color gradient to accentuate the danger of the scene, like an old Hollywood Western. However, many criticize that the color makes Mexico City, a usually colorful and vibrant city, look ugly. And others have criticized it as perpetuating a cliche where Mexico is often depicted inaccurately as being drab and very beige. And I do have to agree, Mexico is very colorful, and I would have liked to have seen the colorful beauty of Mexico City in this scene. Some clever YouTube channels have fixed the color of the scene and brought back some of the vivid colors, including putting Bond in a bright blue suit. And I have to admit, I think it looks much better, and I'll leave a link to that channel in the description below. So Bond changes out of his skull outfit and into an impeccable suit, and this is a cool moment where he coolly walks on the ledge of a roof with a sniper rifle off to assassinate Marco Sciarra. Bond looks on as Sciarra is meeting with 3 other Spectre agents who've acquired a bomb, and the plan is to set off the bomb at some stadium at 6 p.m. for some unknown terrorist event. Bond then takes out the 3 Spectre agents, and then with the 4th shot shoots the briefcase containing the bomb, which explodes, and this causes a chain reaction that causes the entire building to fall. But fortunately, Bond has survived, but so has Marco Sciarra, and the two meet on the street, and Sciarra runs away, but Bond follows in a hot pursuit through the busy Day of the Dead parade. And apparently a building-destroying bomb going off in the middle of the city isn't enough to dampen these celebrations. So let's just say the celebrations were too loud that most people just didn't hear the explosion. Let's go with that. To film the scene, approximately 1,500 local actors were hired for this Mexico sequence, with another 10,000 people being added in via CGI. A helicopter lands in the Plaza de la Constitucion, more commonly known as the Zocalo, and Sciarra gets in, but so does Bond, and Marco and Sciarra fight in the helicopter. And while the two fight off in the air, at one moment the two fight while hanging on outside the helicopter, a reference to Bond hanging on for dear life during the opening teaser of For Your Eyes Only. Bond takes Sciarra's Spectre ring, then kicks him off the helicopter, and the helicopter does 3 corkscrew 360 spiral loops in the air, an homage to when the car does a similar 360 spiral in the air in The Man with the Golden Gun. And remember, this was not a special effect. This was really done practically with a helicopter. Bond sends the helicopter straight up in the air, which causes it to nearly stall and then pummel it to the ground. Bond kicks the pilot out and then tries to recover the copter as it free falls to the ground, an homage to the teaser in GoldenEye. Bond does recover the helicopter and flies off to safety as he examines the ring that he took off Sciarra and the distinctive octopus logo. And we, the audience, recognize it as the Spectre ring. Now for me, the coolest fact to come out of this scene is that prior to this movie, Mexico City did not have a Day of the Dead parade. However, after this movie, in 2016, Mexico City decided to hold its first Day of the Dead parade similar to this movie because this movie was a huge success. And they continued to have a parade every year to this day, and will have one this year as well. So life does copy art. Then we move to the musical montage, and the visual homage, created once again by the great Daniel Kleinman, is filled with octopus imagery. As for the song, The Writing's on the Wall, it's by Sam Smith, and it's not a bad song, if you don't mind Sam Smith's falsetto. But the producers really wanted a love ballad for the music montage, and they did get it here. They originally wanted Radiohead. However, Radiohead turned in a song called Man of War, which they had written on a previous project in the 90s. And Eon Productions wanted a song that could be nominated for an Academy Award, and because this song had been written for something else, this Radiohead song would be ineligible. So Radiohead wrote a second song called Spectre, but Barbara Broccoli and Michael J. Wilson and the producers didn't like it because they thought it sounded too melancholy, and basically fired Radiohead and decided to go with a different musical act. And then they found Sam Smith. And incidentally, Sam Smith's Writing on the Wall did get nominated for an Academy Award and even won the Oscar for Best Original Song. And I didn't really know who Sam Smith was back in 2015, and I thought the song was okay. But of course now he's been in a lot of news and he's pretty famous now. I'm not a fan of his today, but it is interesting to see something that he did before he became more famous. Now the movie proper starts as Bond returns to London and is getting chewed out by M. Because it turns out this whole mission he was on in the opening teaser was not an authorized mission. He was rogue. Although we'll later learn that he was doing it at the request of Judi Dench's M. Now we'll also learn that MI5 and MI6 are merging and that the 00 program is in danger of being shut down. And the man who's going to be the head of this new combined MI5 and MI6 branch is a man named Max Denby, the Director General of the new Joint Intelligence Service. And when he and Bond meet, they already hate each other. Max refers to Bond as his employee and says that the 00 program is in the dark ages, while Bond gives Max Denby the nickname C. So why C? Why not D for Denby? Well, apparently this has two references. The first is that the real-life first director of MI6, Sir Mansfield George Smith Cumming, signed all of his documents C and was known as C. But the second reference is more direct, because in the UK, the letter C is more often associated with the word that starts with C, referring to the female anatomy. And later on, we'll learn that Max Denby is really secretly a Spectre agent. And C is working on a surveillance program called the Nine Eyes. And it's a computerized global surveillance system that would make secret agents like James Bond obsolete, according to C. And Nine Eyes is a reference to something in the real world Five Eyes, which actually exists. The Five Eyes is a massive espionage and intelligence alliance between the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and it was originally formed after World War II to monitor the Soviet Union. But the Five Eyes had been on the news a lot in 2015 because it was discovered in the files released by Edward Snowden a few years earlier that showed that the Five Eyes not only exists, but they've been circumventing domestic regulations and had actually been spying on its own citizens. We then get Naomi Harris returning as Moneypenny, and I really like her chemistry with Daniel Craig. And here we see James Bond's apartment, and this is only the third time we've actually seen Bond's home. We'd seen it before in Dr. No and Live and Let Die, and here they really wrestled with how they should make his apartment look. Well, what they came up with is exactly how you'd imagine Daniel Craig's apartment looking. Very Spartan, very small. What you'd expect from a man that really doesn't have time to lounge around at home, but is always jet-setting all over the world, for England. And when Moneypenny asks what's going on, Bond reveals that he's been following M's orders to kill Sciarra and then attend his funeral. Bond and Tanner visit MI6's new secret base under the dock, and Q's warehouse looks like something out of the Connery era. And Q unveils the new Aston Martin, and the Aston Martin is the DB10, which looks like something from the future. It's a gorgeous car, and like the Aston Martin DB5, it is in silver birch. Incidentally, the Aston Martin DB10 was a special series car designed specifically for this movie in order to celebrate the 5-year relationship between Aston Martin and the James Bond franchise. And only 10 of these Aston Martin DB10s were made, and the car has never been released nor sold to the public. And I have to admit, it's an amazing looking car. Q tells Bond that it was originally designed for him, but now M is going to give it to 009. But Bond is going to steal it for his rogue mission to Rome. And we can already see that the DB10 has all sorts of neat gadgets that we're going to get to see. James Bond travels to Rome to attend Sciarra's funeral, the man he just killed in Mexico City, and he meets Sciarra's widow, Lucia Sciarra, played by Monica Bellucci. And at the funeral, we see the back of Christopher Waltz, who is Blofeld, but Bond thinks he might recognize him. Lucia Sciarra knew that her husband worked for Spectre, so now she knows that she knows too much, and she knows that Spectre will come and murder her tonight. So she turns on loud music, drinks some alcohol, and prepares to be killed any time now. And in the shadows, we actually see her assassins, two of them hiding in the shadows, ready to take her out. And we sense that she knows that they're there, and she knows she's about to be killed. And we hear 2 gunshots, but the assassins are killed. And it's a great James Bond moment. And then the two talk, and I really like this scene where Bond seduces Lucia, because I like their dialogue and I like their chemistry. And she tells him that this powerful organization is having an emergency meeting tonight because of her husband's death to choose a replacement assassin. And they're meeting at the Palazzo Cardenza at midnight. And Bond arranges for Felix Leiter to smuggle her safely out of the country through the embassy. Bond drives to the Palazzo Cardenza, and the Palazzo Cardenza is a fictional place. The exteriors were filmed at the Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, and the interiors were built on the Pinewood set. And at the entrance of the meeting, a guard challenges him, but he presents a Spectre ring that belongs to Sciarra, and the guard instantly assumes that he's a high-ranking Spectre, a member, and backs off, although we learn that this is actually a trap.
It's a trap!
We see that the members of Spectre are discussing all sorts of missions across the world, reminiscent of From Russia with Love and Thunderball. They're discussing drugs, human trafficking of females into the leisure sector, and they're also discussing global surveillance, already suggesting that C does already work for Spectre. Then the leader, Blofeld, comes to the table, and he says that the Pale King must be terminated and that he is the next target. A man named Guerra requests to be considered to replace Marco Sciarra, and they ask if anyone challenges Mr. Guerra for the position, and suddenly Dave Bautista walks in and brutally murders Mr. Guerra and takes over as the new top assassin in Marco Sciarra's place. And in this movie, he is Mr. Hinx, the first true strongman henchman that we've had in a while, and the first for the Daniel Craig movies. And suddenly and quite unexpectedly, Blofeld looks straight at James Bond, who's been observing everything hidden in the distance. And suddenly Bond has to make a daring escape out of the Cardenza and into his Aston Martin. And Mr. Hinx chases Bond's Aston Martin in a bright orange Jaguar CX-75 through the streets of Rome at midnight. And this is a reference to Die Another Day, where Zhao chased Bond's Aston Martin in his bright green Jaguar. And this is an interesting chase because the streets of Rome are oddly empty, and it gives the scene an otherworldly, almost agoraphobic feel. Remember, Sam Mendes and cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema wanted the movie to have an old, golden age Hollywood feel, and I guess they succeeded. But personally, I prefer the lived-in feel of Roger Deakins' work. I think the empty streets cause an emotional distance from the scene where I don't feel the tension of the action. I can intellectually see that it's a very well done sequence, but I don't feel anything. Now, if you want to see a much better version of the scene, I like the busy streets during the action sequence of John Wick 4, where John Wick is fighting the bad guys in the crowded Arc de Triomphe, which helps ground the scene in the real world, thereby increasing the tension of the scene. Here, the emptiness creates a disconnect where I just don't feel tension. Because think of it, the best moments of this chase are when Bond encounters other cars, like the slow driver or that truck almost hits him. Those are the short moments that got my heart pumping. Well, Bond pushes a random button, which causes him to be ejected from the car and the Aston Martin, a reference to the ejector seat in Goldfinger. But it causes the Aston Martin to crash into the Tiber water, destroying itself. And maybe it's kind of a metaphor for this movie, don't you think? Well, before he's ejected, the C automatically puts on a parachute, and after he's ejected from the car, Bond glides through the air safely onto the street, and I gotta admit, that moment did look pretty cool. Now, during the chase, Bond calls Moneypenny, who informs him that the Pale King is Mr. White, the man from Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, and Moneypenny tells Bond that Mr. White is hiding out in Austria. Bond then heads to Austria to confront Mr. White. And wouldn't it have been cool if they did more with Mr. White? I mean, I thought he was just such a great character in Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. Personally, I really wanted Mr. White to turn out to be Blofeld, because that would have been amazing. And it would have created personal animosity between the two. James Bond hates him for Vesper, and Mr. White hates him for shooting him in the leg. And, that tension, it was right there. Even if they didn't make Blofeld Mr. White, he was such a cool character. I would have wanted to see him challenge Blofeld or have two factions of Spectre, like the Blofeld faction and the Quantum faction, and maybe they would fight each other for supremacy with Bond in the middle. I think that would have been so much better than what we ended up getting. So Mr. White is now a shadow of the man he once was. He's hiding out in this really disgusting room, and he's dying of thallium poisoning. And we learn that the company Quantum from Quantum of Solace is a division of Spectre, although I thought Quantum was a much cooler company. And the way they portrayed Quantum, it actually felt like they were more powerful than the way Spectre was portrayed here. And then Mr. Bond says,
"It's everywhere. Everywhere."
And he calls Bond a kite in the wind and kills himself on the promise that Bond will protect his daughter, the estranged Dr. Madeleine Swann. So Bond goes to meet Madeleine Swann, played by Léa Seydoux, at the clinic in the Alps, and the location is the Hoffler Clinic, which deliberately echoes Piz Gloria in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Incidentally, the ski scene in Christopher Nolan's Inception was based on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Sam Mendes, who is a huge Christopher Nolan fan and borrowed a lot of Dark Knight for Skyfall, borrows a lot from Inception, and the Hoffler Clinic scene is an homage to the base in Inception. And Léa Seydoux is okay here as Madeleine Swann, although I thought she was much better in No Time to Die. I recognize Léa Seydoux as Sabine Moreau in Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. And Dr. Madeleine Swann interviews Bond about his past, and it is here that we learn that Bond's parents died in a climbing accident and he was raised by someone else. And it's a nice way for the audience to know that Bond was raised by a foster father. And Bond tells her that her father is dead, she's in danger, and that he can protect her. And for the first time we get Bond saying,
"Vodka martini, shaken, not stirred."
But our expectations are subverted when the bar doesn't serve alcohol. But then suddenly we get Q, who has come to the clinic to retrieve Bond, but then gets talked into helping him instead. Madeleine Swann is captured by Mr. Hinx and his men, but Bond suddenly appears in an airplane. So where did he get that airplane? I think there may have been a deleted scene where he gets in an airplane, because otherwise it would be a plot hole. Well, in the scene when we first see the clinic, right below it you can see a landing strip and you can actually see a little plane there. And so we can assume that that's the plane that Bond took to get to the clinic. Who knows? So, but why not show Bond go down there? It would take 3 seconds, and plus it wouldn't commit the cardinal sin of pulling the audience out of the picture by asking, where did he get that plane? I think it's a mistake. Bond pursues Mr. Hinx and Madeleine Swann, but then the wings of the plane hit a tree and fall off, and we get Bond pursuing them on the plane without wings. And he rams Hinx's car and rescues Madeleine. And it's not a bad scene. Although what does make it cool is that it was not special effects, it was not CGI. This scene really was done practically. Bond learns from Madeleine that an organization that her father, Mr. White, belonged to is called Spectre, and that her father kept all her clues in a hotel in Tangiers called L'Américaine. And the two go there and discover Mr. White's stash of information, and they find a potential location of Spectre's base in Morocco. So Bond and Madeleine Swann take a train to Morocco. And on the train, Bond wears a white dinner jacket and red carnation, an homage to the same look Sean Connery wore in the opening scene of Goldfinger. And suddenly they're attacked by Mr. Hinx, and it's a brutal hand-to-hand fight, echoing the fight between Bond and Red Grant in From Russia with Love, which in turn was homaged again later in The Spy Who Loved Me when Jaws attacked Bond and Triple X on the train. Madeleine shoots Mr. Hinx in the shoulder, saving him, and Bond is able to wrap a rope around Hinx's neck and throw him overboard the train. And this scene, there's a row of barrels that fall out of the train one by one before yanking him to death, and this was a reference to a similar scene in Steven Spielberg's movie Jaws, which in turn inspired the character of Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me, which Mr. Hinx is homaging. And in fact, Sam Mendes placed the exact number of barrels on this rack that the boat had in the movie Jaws. And then this leads to a passionate scene between Madeleine and Bond. And I know a lot of people didn't like her, but I thought she was okay here. I liked their chemistry, although I really liked her in the next movie. Well, they're dropped off in the middle of nowhere, only to be picked up by a yellow Rolls-Royce Phantom 3. And this is a reference to the exact same car that Oddjob drove Goldfinger around in Goldfinger. And they're driven to a crater in the middle of the desert, and in the center of that crater is the Spectre base. And this is a reference to the Spectre base being underneath a volcano in You Only Live Twice. And parts of the Spectre base, the house with the glass and the lawn, is a real location in Morocco. It's the Darbianca Villa, which really exists, and it was built in 2006. It's a 2-story house, has 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a separate guest house with 3 more bedrooms, and it has a swimming pool, and incidentally, recently went on sale for $4.7 million. So Bond is shown around this base, which was supposed to give you this weird, haunting, perhaps dizzying feeling, but I have to admit, I felt underwhelmed. I thought they did it much better in other films like Dr. No or in You Only Live Twice. Compare this base to past bases like Stromberg's base in The Spy Who Loved Me or Hugo Drax's base in Moonraker. Those were sights to behold. I would have liked to have seen them go all out like in those movies. But here, it's just so boring. And of course, you've seen this movie before and you know what's coming. Bond comes face to face with Franz Oberhauser, aka Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who shows Bond that he has spy cameras everywhere, and here's where we find out that C works for Spectre. But Bond is knocked out, and when he awakens, he's tied to a chair, and Blofeld is planning on doing psychosurgery on Bond to manipulate his brain matter so that he won't recognize human faces. Oh, okay. And the torture scene is meant to evoke the torture scene in Casino Royale, as well as a torture scene in The World Is Not Enough. And here we learn that James Bond was actually raised by a man named Hans Oberhauser, and the cool part is that it wasn't made up for this movie. Hans Oberhauser is actually from the books, and they are the same character. So in the book Octopussy, Hans Oberhauser is found murdered and James Bond is sent to investigate, and in the novel, Bond was actually raised by a man named Hans Oberhauser, and he was James's mentor who raised him after the death of his parents. And in the novel, it was Oberhauser that taught Bond to ski. And in that book, Bond describes Oberhauser as, quote, "He taught me to ski before the war when I was in my teens. He was something of a wonderful man. He was something of a father to me when I needed one." And then so we go back to this movie where it turns out that Hans Oberhauser had another son named Franz Oberhauser.
I'm Hans. And I'm Franz. And we want to pump you up.
Franz Oberhauser, who was jealous that his father was getting close to Bond, so he killed his father, then faked his own death, renamed himself after his mother's side, Blofeld, and then created like the world's most powerful criminal organization. And just so that he could torture Bond behind the scenes, when I guess he's not trying to take over the world. So basically, Blofeld is Bond's brother. Yuck. And then we get Blofeld's lecture about the cuckoo. And Bond hands Madeline his exploding watch, and they blow up the room, and Blofeld with it, and they take out the men guarding the base. And Bond coolly walks out of the room and begins to gun down all the Spectre agents. And this scene did remind me of a video game where Bond, how he's practically invincible, takes down the whole base by himself. And I think that's one of the complaints about this scene is that there's really never a sense of danger to Bond. There's no sense of challenge. It's very sterile and ultimately very unexciting. And they blow up the Spectre base. Now this explosion was not a special effect. It was actually done in real life. And it was one of the largest explosions in any movie, Bond film or otherwise. The explosion involved 8,100 liters of kerosene and 24 kilograms of high explosives. And to this day, it holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest film stunt explosion in cinematic history. But even this explosion, there's just something cold and sterile about it. We never feel Bond or Swan is ever in danger. We never feel this challenge to Bond, right? No emotion, no sense of stakes. Something is just missing. Did you feel the same way? Let me know in the comments below. The two take a helicopter and make it to London, and there is something I kind of liked about this London scene. I like that M, Tanner, Moneypenny, and Q decide to go rogue and help Bond. And it cements this friendship between them that transcended their jobs. And it reminded me of License to Kill, where Q goes rogue to help Bond, or on Her Majesty's Secret Service, where Moneypenny helps Bond by not turning in his letter of resignation, but changes it so that he requests 2 weeks leave, and then M thanks her for doing that. It reminds me that ultimately they are all friends that care about each other. And here's another reference. When they go to the safe house is called Hildebrandt Rarities and Antiques. And this is a reference to the Hildebrandt Rarity, which is the title of a James Bond short story written by Ian Fleming. And in that story, a man named Milton Kress abuses his wife with a stingray tail, and these elements were borrowed for the movie License to Kill. At the safe house, M meets with Bond, who tells M that C is working with Blofeld. And when the Nine Eyes program goes live at midnight, Spectre will have access to the world's global surveillance. Bond is abducted by Spectre agents, and when they get ready to kill M, he's already escaped. And I love that M is a man of action. Now then there's this really cool scene. The Spectre agents have Bond tied up with a hood over his head, but he's easily able to take them out. And this is a cool James Bond moment. So where did the Spectre agents take Bond? Well, they take him to the old MI6 building. Now remember, this is a real building in the real world. It's the Secret Intelligence Service building at Vauxhall Hall, and it opened in 1994, and it was heavily featured in the Pierce Brosnan films, as well as Quantum of Solace and Skyfall. But in this movie, the idea is that C, who's a Spectre agent, is having it torn down and demolished and replacing it with his own building nearby. And in C's building, M confronts him, they fight, and C is killed. Bond goes into the ruins of the MI6 headquarters, and Blofeld has created a weird funhouse for him with images of Mr. White, Vesper, Green, Silva, and M, where he reminds Bond that he's been pulling the strings on all those events. And the idea of a villain who has a funhouse was inspired by Scaramanga's funhouse on his island in The Man with the Golden Gun. And I'll tell you about this entire funhouse scene. I thought it was so stupid. I hated this scene. It was just so idiotic. In fact, it's from this point on that I wonder if everyone involved in making this movie just gave up. It's so amateurly written and it just feels phoned in. Blofeld tells Bond that he kidnapped Madeleine Swan and a bomb will go off in 3 minutes so Bond can try to save her or save himself. And yeah, I think Batman Forever did this scene so much better. Bond does manage to save Madeleine as Blofeld gets away in a helicopter. Bond gets on a boat and begins to shoot at Blofeld's helicopter from a distance, and one bullet ends up taking the whole helicopter down, causing it to crash into the street, killing Blofeld's men and sending Blofeld crawling on the ground. Blofeld is arrested, and the movie basically is over. So I'm telling you, I wonder, did everyone just run out of ideas? Did the writers just give up? Like, what is going on? What is with this movie? That said, I did like the very ending of the movie where we get Bond in his Aston Martin and Madeleine sitting next to him as he drives off in his DB5 with the James Bond theme music playing. So that little brief ending was pretty cool. And so ends a bit of a confusing mess. It was a highly anticipated movie, it had very high expectations, and it started off kind of strong and wasn't bad for the first half. It kind of trudged along after that, and then it plunged into depth so bad that it became a parody of itself, going into Austin Powers territory, and then went back and ruined the last 3 Bond movies, and then it looks like the filmmakers just gave up and ended the movie. Ultimately, they totally blew it. Now, critically, it did get mixed reviews, although it did skew slightly toward the positive. And it holds a disappointing 64% of critics liking it on Rotten Tomatoes, and CinemaScore audience poll gave the film an average of A-. Mark Kermode, the film critic for The Observer, loved this film and gave the film 4 out of 5 stars, while conceding that it didn't live up to the standards of Skyfall, but was still a great movie. And you can see his positive review of this movie online. IGN Magazine rated it 7 out of 10 and considered it solid if unspectacular, and concluding that the film falls frustratingly short of greatness. In a review by RogerEbert.com, Matt Zoller Seitz gave Spectre 2.5 out of 4 stars, describing it as inconsistent and unable to capitalize on its potential. And Forbes magazine heavily criticized the film, denouncing Spectre as the worst 007 movie in 30 years. The movie was released in November 2015, and the movie had the biggest opening of all time in the United Kingdom, with an estimated £41 million taken at the British box office in its first 7 days. The film made $200.1 million in North America, and it also made about $630 million overseas, including $135 million in the UK, bringing the worldwide total to $881 million. And while it fell short of Skyfall, Spectre was not a disappointing box office. It was still very profitable. So in early October, everyone wanted to know if Daniel Craig was going to return as Bond, And he was pretty adamant about not returning to do a fifth James Bond film. And he even said in an interview that he'd rather slash his wrists than play Bond again. However, in November, he sort of began hinting that he would be willing to return for Bond 25. And in August 2017, on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, Craig officially announced that he would be returning for one more Bond film.
Daniel Craig, will you return as James Bond?
Yes.
And that movie would be the final film in the Daniel Craig 007 film series, No Time to Die, which we'll talk about that movie next. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.